At level 1, you're the newest firefighter in the station, which means you're still learning, constantly training, checking equipment, helping around the firehouse, and trying to prove that when the alarm goes off, the rest of the crew can actually depend on you. You might be the person carrying equipment, pulling hose, climbing ladders, or following an experienced officer into a situation you've never seen outside of training. But if you spend enough years in the profession and keep moving through the ranks, your job can eventually become almost unrecognizable. Instead of being the firefighter waiting for instructions, you could become the person commanding multiple crews at a major emergency, managing several stations, or eventually running an entire fire department with hundreds of firefighters, millions of dollars in equipment, and responsibility for emergency services across an entire city. The interesting part is that every promotion takes you a little farther away from the job you originally trained to do. At the beginning, your value comes from how well you can perform under pressure. Later, you're responsible for making sure a crew performs under pressure. Keep climbing, and eventually, you're responsible for building the system that all of those crews depend on. The money changes along the way, too. Across the United States, the median annual pay for firefighters is around $60,000, but location, experience, overtime, and department contracts can move that number dramatically in either direction. In some departments, experienced firefighters and officers can earn well into six figures, while senior command positions can go considerably higher. So how do you get from being the newest person in the firehouse to the person responsible for the entire department? To understand that, we have to go through 7 very different levels of the career. This is every level of being a firefighter explained. Level 1 is the probationary firefighter, usually called the Probie, and this is where you discover that graduating from the fire academy doesn't automatically make you an experienced firefighter. You've learned the fundamentals, passed the tests, and earned your place in the station, but now you have to prove that you can actually use those skills when the situation isn't controlled by an instructor. During probation, you're going to spend a lot of time training and learning exactly how your department operates. You'll work with hoses, ladders, breathing equipment, rescue tools, medical equipment, and all the other gear that needs to become familiar enough that you can use it while you're exhausted, stressed, wearing heavy protective clothing, and surrounded by people who expect you to know what you're doing. And the job isn't 24 hours of dramatic fires. A huge amount of time goes into checking equipment, inspecting the apparatus, maintaining the station, training, and making sure everything is ready before the next call arrives. That preparation matters because emergencies don't care whether you were eating dinner, cleaning equipment, or sleeping 5 minutes earlier. When the alarm comes in, you need to be ready to move. The calls themselves can also be much more varied than people expect. Depending on the department, you might respond to structure fires, medical emergencies, vehicle collisions, rescues, hazardous material incidents, and plenty of situations that have almost nothing to do with the burning building. You're essentially becoming someone the city can send when something has gone seriously wrong and the people already there don't know how to fix it. Starting pay varies enormously depending on location, but for our career ladder, roughly $40,000 to $60,000 or more gives us a useful, broad picture of what an entry-level firefighter might encounter. Some departments fall below that. Some are considerably higher, and overtime can change the final paycheck substantially. At this point, though, the most important thing you're earning isn't money. It's trust. Once the crew knows that you can do your job when things become difficult, you're no longer just the new person trying to keep up. You're becoming an established firefighter, and that's where Level 2 begins. Level 2 is the firefighter, and this is where you become a fully established member of the crew. You've survived probation. You've spent enough time training that basic procedures have become familiar, and now people expect you to arrive at an emergency ready to do the job without somebody explaining every step. This is also the level that looks most like the version of firefighting people see in movies. At a structure fire, you might advance a hose line, force a door, search rooms, raise ladders, ventilate part of a building, or help remove somebody who can't get out on their own. The difference is that real firefighting involves far more than dramatic structure fires, and depending on the department, a large part of your workload can involve medical calls, vehicle crashes, and other emergencies. Experience changes the way you see those situations. A new firefighter can walk into an emergency and see smoke, noise, and confusion, while an experienced firefighter begins seeing information. You start noticing where the fire may be moving, what the building is doing, where your exits are, what your crew is doing, and what equipment you're probably going to need before somebody has to ask for it. You still operate within a command structure and follow orders, but you're becoming much better at understanding why those orders are being given. That's important because good crews don't function like a group of people waiting for instructions every 5 seconds. Experienced firefighters learn to anticipate what comes next while staying coordinated with the people around them. Nationally, firefighter pay sits around a $60,000 median, but that number hides a massive amount of variation. Geography matters, seniority matters, overtime matters, and some firefighters in high-paying departments can earn more than $100,000 a year, especially once additional compensation is included. But after years of riding to emergencies and learning how the entire operation works, there's another job sitting only a few feet away from you. Somebody has to drive several tons of fire apparatus through traffic, get the crew there safely, and then make sure the firefighters attacking the fire actually have the water and equipment they need. That's Level 3. Level 3 is the driver or engineer, although the exact title depends on the department. From the outside, this can sound like a fairly simple promotion because you're the person driving the fire engine. But getting a huge emergency vehicle through traffic quickly and safely is only one part of the job. When the alarm comes in, you're driving a vehicle that can weigh tens of thousands of pounds while traffic is moving around you. Pedestrians may be crossing streets, and everyone inside the apparatus is depending on you to get them to the emergency without creating another emergency along the way. You also need to understand the streets, access points, and limitations of a vehicle that is considerably larger than almost everything else on the road. Then you arrive at a structure fire and suddenly the job changes. On an engine company, the engineer may be responsible for operating the pump system and maintaining the water supply that firefighters are depending on while they attack the fire. That means understanding hydrants, hose lines, pressure, water flow, and the capabilities of the apparatus well enough that you can solve problems immediately. Think about what that responsibility actually means. There may be firefighters inside a burning structure depending on a hose line, and the water reaching that line is being controlled by equipment you're operating outside. This is not the moment when you want to discover that you only vaguely remember how the pump system works. The engineer also needs to know the apparatus almost like a mechanic knows a machine. Fire engines carry an enormous amount of equipment, and when something is needed at an emergency, the crew doesn't want to spend 10 minutes figuring out where it is or why it isn't working. Compensation usually rises with the promotion, although there's no universal national engineer salary. Depending on the department, location, and overtime, experienced driver engineers can move into roughly the $60,000 to $100,000 plus range, with some high-paying departments going beyond that. But this promotion is still mostly about mastering equipment and operations. The next major step changes something much more important, because instead of being responsible primarily for a truck and its systems, you're going to become responsible for the people riding on it. Level 4 is the lieutenant, and this is where firefighting starts turning into leadership. You're now an officer, which means your job is no longer just to perform well yourself. You have firefighters working under you, and their preparation, coordination, and performance can become part of your responsibility. At the station, that means training, assignments, inspections, paperwork, equipment, and the everyday challenge of managing people who may have very different levels of experience. You might have a firefighter who has been doing the job for years, working beside somebody who finished probation recently, and both of them need to function as one crew when the alarm comes in. At an emergency, that responsibility becomes much more serious. You may be leading firefighters into a structure, deciding what task the crew needs to perform, monitoring conditions, and constantly evaluating whether the situation is still safe enough to continue. The people behind you aren't simply watching what you do anymore. They're trusting your judgment. That's one of the biggest psychological changes in the entire career. As a firefighter, you can focus heavily on performing your own assignment correctly. As an officer, part of your attention always has to be on everyone else. Where is your crew? Are they doing what you expect? Are conditions changing? Does somebody need help? Is it time to get out? The salary increase doesn't always feel proportional to the increase in responsibility. Depending on the department, lieutenant base pay might fall somewhere around $70,000 to $120,000 or more, while overtime and other compensation can push total earnings considerably higher in some cities. But the real promotion isn't the paycheck. It's the fact that people are now waiting for your decisions. Do that job well for long enough, and eventually you can become the officer responsible for an entire company or station. Level 5 is the fire captain, and now you're moving into a position where leadership becomes one of the defining parts of the job. Depending on the department, a captain may supervise a company, station, or another operational unit, which means you're responsible not only for what happens during emergencies, but also for whether the crew is prepared before those emergencies happen. Inside the station, you're dealing with training, staffing, performance, equipment, and the countless small decisions required to keep a crew functioning properly. When something goes wrong during an emergency, you don't get to say that everybody simply had a bad day. Part of your job is making sure the crew was prepared before the call ever arrived. At the scene of a fire, the decisions become faster and much more consequential. You need to understand what the building is doing, whether anybody may be trapped, where crews should operate, what resources are missing, and how quickly conditions are changing. Sometimes there is enough time to build a careful plan, and sometimes the first few minutes are nothing but incomplete information and decisions that still need to be made immediately. This is where years of experience start becoming incredibly valuable. A captain who has seen hundreds or thousands of calls isn't magically able to predict the future, but they can recognize patterns that a newer firefighter may not even know exist. They've seen what happens when conditions deteriorate, when an apparently small fire suddenly spreads, and when a decision that looked reasonable 30 seconds ago needs to change. The money can become substantial at this point, particularly in larger or higher-paying departments. As a real-world example of how wide the range can become, a 2026 promotional posting in Alexandria, Virginia listed fire captain compensation from roughly $88,000 to more than $155,000 annually. That's not what every captain in America makes, but it shows why location matters so much when talking about firefighter salaries. And once you've learned how to command one company, there's another jump waiting above you. Instead of looking after one crew and one apparatus, you may eventually arrive at an incident where several companies are operating at the same time. That's when the scale changes again. Level 6 is the battalion chief, and this is where you begin looking at an emergency from a completely different perspective. Instead of focusing on one crew, you may be responsible for coordinating multiple companies, apparatus, and officers operating across a larger area or incident. Imagine a serious structure fire with several engines, ladder trucks, rescue units, and ambulances arriving from different stations. Each crew has its own assignment, but somebody needs to understand how all of those assignments fit together. That's where command becomes less about performing individual tasks and more about managing the entire operation. You need to know where crews are working, what progress they're making, whether additional resources are needed, whether the building is becoming unstable, where incoming units should stage, and what happens if the original plan stops working. You can't personally stand beside every firefighter, which means communication and command structure become absolutely critical. There's an interesting contradiction here. As your responsibility grows, you may actually move physically farther away from the fire. The rookie is carrying equipment toward the building. The firefighter may be operating inside it. The company officer is leading a crew, while the battalion chief may be positioned outside trying to understand everything happening at once. That doesn't mean the job becomes easier. It means the type of pressure changes. Instead of concentrating on the room directly in front of you, you're thinking about several crews, multiple objectives, and how one decision could affect everybody operating at the scene. Compensation can again move well into six figures in some departments. For example, Alexandria lists battalion chief compensation at roughly $96,000 to $170,000, although other departments can pay substantially less or more depending on location and structure. At this point, you've climbed from performing emergency work to commanding major emergency operations. But there's still another level above incident command, because somebody has to manage the department itself. Level 7 is the fire chief, and by this point, the career can look almost nothing like it did when you were the probie checking equipment at the beginning. You're no longer responsible for one apparatus, one crew, one station, or even one emergency. You're helping run the organization responsible for responding to emergencies across an entire jurisdiction. Depending on the size of the department, that organization could include dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of firefighters and other employees, along with fire stations, engines, ladder trucks, ambulances, specialized units, training facilities, and an enormous inventory of equipment that all has to be staffed, maintained, and funded. Your problems have changed too. Now you're thinking about budgets, hiring, promotions, training standards, staffing, equipment purchases, labor relations, emergency planning, community safety, and how the department should prepare for problems that may not happen for years. You may spend more time in meetings than you do anywhere near a fire. And that's not because the emergency side stopped mattering. It's because your decisions now happen much earlier in the chain. If the department doesn't hire enough people, train them correctly, replace aging equipment, or put resources in the right places, those decisions can eventually affect what happens when somebody calls 911. That's the strange reality of reaching the top of this profession. You might have become a firefighter because you wanted to respond when people needed help. But eventually, your biggest contribution becomes building an organization capable of sending the right people with the right equipment and the right training when that help is needed. Fire chief compensation varies so dramatically by department size and location that giving one universal number would be misleading. Smaller departments can pay considerably less, while chiefs and senior command staff in major jurisdictions can earn well into six figures. At this level, the scale of the organization matters almost as much as the title itself. And that's really the transformation we've been following from the beginning. At the bottom, you're being paid to perform. In the middle, you're being paid to lead. At the top, you're being paid to build and manage the system that allows everyone underneath you to perform. So that's the ladder: probationary firefighter, firefighter, driver or engineer, lieutenant, captain, battalion chief, and finally, fire chief. The exact titles and structure can change from one department to another, but the overall progression follows the same basic idea. Every promotion increases the number of people, equipment, and decisions you're responsible for. You might begin your career checking gear, maintaining the station, and trying to prove that the crew can trust you when something goes wrong. Years later, you could be commanding multiple companies at a major incident or managing an entire department with a budget, fleet, stations, and hundreds of people depending on the decisions you make. The salary can rise dramatically along the way, from entry-level pay that may start around the $40,000 to $60,000 range in many places to six-figure compensation for experienced officers and senior command positions in higher-paying departments. But location and overtime matter so much that two firefighters with similar titles can end up with very different paychecks. The bigger transformation is responsibility. At level 1, someone tells you where to go and what needs to be done. Then they trust you to do the job without being watched. Later, they trust you with the apparatus, then a crew, then a company, then multiple companies, and eventually an entire organization. And that's what makes the career ladder so interesting. The higher you climb, the farther you may get from the hose, the ladder, and the burning building that originally defined the job. But at the same time, every decision you make can affect more of the people who are still standing there. And that's every level of being a firefighter explained.